The air hung thick, saturated with the fine, chalky dust of pulverized French roads and the acrid smoke of burnt oil. It is the late afternoon of August 28, 1944. The place is an anonymous, sun-scorched stretch of road near the Meuse, hundreds of miles east of the Normandy beaches. For the men of the German 7th Army, the reality here is total, brutal inversion. They are not merely retreating, they are being ejected. The noise is a chaotic symphony of failure. The groan of overloaded engines, the curses muffled by exhaustion, the desperate, hollow clatter of steel treads tearing up tarmac only to abandon it a mile later. A German Hauptmann, a veteran tank commander named Kuno, who had fought from the Russian steppe to the hedgerows of Caen, leans against the inert chassis of his Panther. Its 75 millimeters of steel, once the undisputed master of the battlefield, is now just a heavy, stationary piece of scrap. His engine is silent. His radio is silent. His fuel gauge points to empty. Kuno's men are sprawled on the roadside, helmet straps loosened, faces coated in dust and defeat. They are awaiting the same inevitable order they have been awaiting for 3 weeks: abandon the machine. They wait because, according to every known axiom of military science, the enemy must stop. Every deep armored thrust in history stalls. The logistics of war, the oil, the steel, the food, follow immutable geometric laws. The further the spear point drives, the longer the shaft of supply must stretch, and the more fragile it becomes. They expected the Americans to be 30 miles away, perhaps 40, bogged down, refueling, repairing, consolidating. They expected the Americans to be thirsty, but they were not. In the distance, an impossible sound begins to register over the dying echo of the retreat. It is a steady, low-frequency hum, the deep-chested growl of thousands of internal combustion engines. Not the intermittent roar of battle or the sharp crackle of pursuit, but a relentless mechanical rhythm, the gravel-grinding roar of the GMC CCKW. The American deuce-and-a-half truck, the 75-horsepower heart of American abundance. It is the sound of a supply line running at full, impossible throttle. It is the sound of the Red Ball Express. This moment, this geographical point where Kuno's Panther ran dry, is where the Second World War was irrevocably redefined. The Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, these were dramatic confrontations. But the true devastating victory of the summer of 1944 was won not by the man firing the rifle, but by the logistics that delivered the bullet, and more importantly, the fuel, faster than the enemy could conceive of retreating. The historical context is simple yet overwhelming. The Normandy breakout, Operation Cobra. When General George S. Patton's Third Army finally burst free of the suffocating hedgerows of Normandy in late July 1944, he unleashed a speed that stunned the world, including his own superiors. In the 30 days that followed, Patton's spearhead advanced on average 25 to 40 miles per day. They covered over 400 miles in a non-stop, blistering sprint that shattered the cohesion of the German armies in the West. This speed, while militarily exhilarating, created a terminal logistical crisis. The tail of the dragon could not keep up with the head. The supply bases were still tied to the initial landings and the few crippled port facilities like Cherbourg. The Allied armies required approximately 12,500 tons of materiel daily, just to maintain the advance. Every mile Patton gained was a mile further for fuel, ammunition, and rations to travel over congested, damaged roads and temporary bridges. By the time the Third Army reached the vicinity of Reims and Verdun, they were driving entirely on fumes, metaphorically and literally. The entire offensive was threatening to grind to the exact inevitable halt the Germans expected. The American logistics chief, General John C.H. Lee, recognized the moment of decision. The Allies had to choose between a standard safe consolidation, ceding the advantage of speed, or an audacious, desperate solution. They chose audacity. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express was formally inaugurated. It was named after a railroad term for expedited freight. A Red Ball shipment was too important to be delayed. The mission was to create an iron artery, an immense, dedicated one-way system of roads leading directly from the depots near Cherbourg and Avranches to the forward staging areas outside Paris and further east. The system was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its scale. It consisted of two main arteries: the northern route, designated for movement to the front, and the southern route designated for movement from the front, empty trucks returning. This separation was sacrosanct. No matter the immediate need, no vehicle was permitted to travel the northern route heading west, and no truck was permitted to travel the southern route heading east. The flow had to be absolute, relentless, and unidirectional. To maintain this, a colossal undertaking was required. The Red Ball Express ultimately comprised nearly 6,000 vehicles, primarily the rugged GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks. To staff these vehicles, 12,000 men were mobilized. And here is where the deeper story of American abundance and the complexities of its democracy collide. In the segregated U.S. Army of 1944, combat roles were largely reserved for white soldiers, relegating African American troops to auxiliary, support, and service roles. The vast majority of the drivers, the mechanics, the dispatchers, and the guards of the Red Ball Express, upwards of 90%, were African American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps and the Transportation Corps. These men were given the most dangerous, monotonous, and mission-critical task of the entire European campaign. They were the anonymous engine of Patton's speed, the human fuel behind the fuel. They had not enlisted to drive trucks for 18 hours a day. They had enlisted for service, yet found themselves battling not the Wehrmacht, but exhaustion, prejudice, and the sheer, endless stretch of the road. The truck, the ubiquitous deuce and a half, became the recurring symbol of this strange American victory. It was an uncomplicated machine, designed for mass production, reliable, and utterly tireless. Its production numbers dwarfed any single vehicle the Germans possessed. Each truck, laden with 10 tons of cargo, represented a logistical triumph. But when multiplied by 5,000, and moving in convoys that stretched for miles, the cumulative weight of this industrial capacity became a hammer blow against German military theory. Hauptmann Kuno, miles ahead of the actual Red Ball route, was experiencing the aftershock of this hammer. He had been fighting an army that, by all rational calculation, should have been out of gas, its tanks immobile, its guns quiet. Instead, the Americans continued to press. The tanks of the 4th Armored Division had advanced so rapidly that they were consistently relying on airdropped fuel for the final miles. Yet immediately behind them, the necessary ground support always appeared, sometimes delayed by a day, but never fundamentally broken. This logistical shock, this constant, unrelenting provisioning, was the core of the psychological contrast. What the German commanders expected was the blitzkrieg model to falter. The German doctrine of lightning war relied on short, sharp thrusts, lived off the land, and was inherently limited by its reliance on railway networks and finite fuel reserves. Their military planners viewed the American advance through their own lens. The enemy was overextended. Their supply line must be fragile, vulnerable to the very same partisan and air attacks that had plagued their own campaigns in Russia. They were waiting for the exhaustion of the capitalist machine. What they experienced was not exhaustion, but an abundance they could not quantify, let alone counter. They saw captured American soldiers with individual ration kits, C rations and K rations, that contained more variety and higher caloric content than their own frontline troops received. They found abandoned fuel depots where the tanks were not measured in liters but in dozens of thousands of gallons. The industrial might of a democracy that had not been bombed, whose factories ran 24 hours a day, whose oil reserves were effectively limitless, was manifesting on the battlefields of France not as a wave of high-tech weaponry, but as a simple, overwhelming quantity of basic resources. The sound of the CCKW engine, therefore, was more than just noise to the retreating Germans. It was the rhythmic pulse of an industrial colossus. The German supply chain was a nervous, broken thing, isolated transports moving cautiously at night, constantly under threat from Allied fighter bombers. The infamous Jabos, the American supply chain, the Red Ball moved in broad daylight, in disciplined convoys, effectively creating its own protected highway, a temporary, asphalt and dust extension of the American mainland. To understand the sheer effort required, one must look at the road itself. The Red Ball route, nearly 400 miles long, was not just a line on a map. It was an organizational miracle. Convoys of 80 to 100 trucks moved in lockstep, nose to tail, with a mandatory 50-minute break every 5 hours. The drivers, often on the road for 36 straight hours, battled the mental and physical toll of monotony and danger. They drove on amphetamines and sheer willpower, staring into the swirling vortex of the truck ahead, the perpetual, choking dust their only companion. The sheer volume is the key historical evidence. During the Red Ball's operational peak, in early September 1944, it was moving over 12,500 tons of supplies per day, matching the entire Allied Army's daily requirement. On one critical day, September 1, 1944, as Patton's armor prepared to cross the Meuse, the Red Ball delivered a stunning 17,200 tons of cargo. This delivery was not just impressive, it was decisive. It meant Patton, despite the impossible speed of his advance, had the essential fuel to keep driving toward Metz and the German frontier, denying the Wehrmacht any chance to stabilize a defensive line west of the Siegfried. This overwhelming logistical effort created a transformation, both on the battlefield and within the segregated American military. For the German forces, the transformation was one of ideology cracking under material reality. The Nazi regime's propaganda had painted the Americans as soft, decadent, and incapable of the necessary sacrifice for total war. They believed in the superiority of their doctrine and the iron will of the Aryan soldier, the sight of a seemingly endless column of American trucks, predominantly driven by African American troops, a segment of the population the Nazi racial theorists dismissed as subhuman, carrying the lifeblood of a war machine that never stopped, was a contradiction too profound to reconcile. The supply line became, in a twisted way, a visual representation of the futility of their ideological premises, when faced with the output of a functioning, if imperfect, industrial democracy. For the American troops at the front, the transformation was simpler, a sudden, powerful faith in the unseen mechanisms of support. The tank crews, resting briefly, would smell the familiar scent of high-octane gasoline, a scent more reassuring than any artillery barrage. They knew, even if they never saw the faces behind the wheel, that the logistics tail was not just following. It was chasing them, urging them forward, enabling their audacity. The Red Ball Express transformed logistics from a military limitation into a military weapon. Speed itself became a force multiplier, fueled by the dedication of its largely unheralded black drivers. The road itself took on symbolic significance. The Red Ball route was a ribbon of democratic endeavor, a stretch of asphalt and gravel where the promise of American industrial capacity met the reality of the European front. The men who drove the route suffered immensely. Their trucks, maintained under impossible deadlines, often broke down. They faced exhaustion-related accidents, occasional German stragglers, and the constant threat of aerial attack. They were given the task of keeping the Third Army moving, and they did it with a dedication that transcended the segregation that marked their service. The recurring sound of the gravel-grinding roar of the GMC CCKW became the anthem of this democratic abundance. It was the sound of the engine, not the gun. It was the sound of production, not destruction. It was the sound of a country that could afford to burn fuel recklessly because it had so much more to spare. Consider the 5-gallon jerry can. The original German design, the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, was so superior that the Allies immediately copied it, calling it the Blitzcan or jerry can. This simple, stamped metal vessel, easy to stack, quick to pour, was itself a symbol of practical genius. Yet where the German machine constantly ran low on the fuel to fill the can, the American Red Ball Express had an unending, seemingly inexhaustible supply. The German can, adopted by the American system, was filled and delivered with an efficiency that the inventors themselves could not match. The can became a vessel of democratic superiority. The advance paused momentarily near Verdun, a place synonymous with static, agonizing trench warfare, a place where, 28 years prior, the cost of a single mile was tens of thousands of lives. Now Patton's men swept through it, not in inches but in hours. This speed was the ultimate repudiation of the bloody stalemate of the last war, a demonstration that the internal combustion engine, when fed by an endless supply chain, had rendered static defense obsolete. The American advance slowed only when the logistics problem was compounded by the weather and the difficulty of crossing major river barriers and, crucially, when the Germans finally had time to scrape together a genuine, cohesive defense along their border, culminating in the desperate stand in the Hurtgen forest. The Red Ball Express, having achieved the impossible for over 2 months, had given the Allied command the priceless gift of time, forcing the Germans to defend deep in France rather than resting behind the Siegfried Line. By November 1944, as Allied forces captured major ports like Antwerp, the mission of the Red Ball Express began to wind down. The temporary artery could yield to the efficiency of established rail and port facilities. The 6,000 trucks and the 12,000 men who had performed the miracle of supply faded back into the obscurity of their support roles. The historical record often focuses on the general and the tank commander, the visible heroes of the attack. But the deeper, more profound truth of the Western campaign lies in the unseen effort of the Quartermaster Corps, the African-American soldiers of the Red Ball Express who delivered the fuel for the tanks to burn, who delivered the food for the soldiers to eat, and who delivered the ammunition for the guns to fire. Their duty was a silent, grinding, non-stop effort, a testament to the fact that freedom, when industrialized and democratized, can move faster than tyranny can retreat. It was their collective will that transformed the logistical choke point into a relentless torrent of material. It was their exhaustion, their sleepless nights behind the wheel of the Deuce and a Half, that translated the vast oil reserves of Texas into the decisive speed of a tank racing toward the Rhine. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate expression of American abundance. It proved that in the 20th century, the speed of your ideology was determined not merely by the strength of your will, but by the efficiency of your delivery. The sound of the grinding gears and the roar of the engines, the gravel-grinding roar of the GMC CCKW, has long since vanished from the quiet French countryside. But the lesson remains imprinted on the historical record. It was the capacity to deliver, to sustain, and to endlessly fuel the advance that broke the back of the German resistance in the summer of 1944. And so, we return to the sound of silence. The war machine, having achieved its speed, settles. The great highway of supply, once alive with the grinding rhythm of trucks, grows quiet. The German Hauptmann, Kuno, having abandoned his silent panther, never truly understood why the Americans never stopped, never truly grasped that the unseen force, the logistical heart of a nation of factory workers and tireless drivers, was not just keeping pace with Patton's tanks, but actively pushing them faster than retreat itself could carry him away. The speed of democracy, he discovered, is not limited by terrain or distance, but only by the ultimate, inexhaustible will of a collective to deliver its promise.